Ethicuties, welcome to Ethicsverse Day. This is the biggest event in our space, the biggest ethics and compliance event in the world. We got a real treat for you today. We have 4 phenomenal sessions. As we get started, this first session, so the first session is going to be about behavioral economics, behavioral science. The second session is going to be the great AI debate. The third session, we have Tyson Duva coming from, he is the current Assistant Attorney General of the Criminal Division. And then we have an amazing panel of DOJ insiders. And finally, we're going to be wrapping up with the Great Women of Compliance Ask Me Anything session. If this is your first time at the Ethicsverse, welcome to the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern, and one day a year when we do one of these knockdown, drag out sessions. So here is our agenda for today. As I'm running through these quick announcements before we dive in to this first session, which is called Predictably Irrational, What Behavioral Science Can Teach Us About Wrongdoing Inside the Organization. As I'm running through these announcements, drop your LinkedIn URL in the chat. Your network is your net worth. Neither are big enough. So we're already up to 1,000 emojis. We're trying to break all kinds of records today. Last year we had 20,000 emojis, so we want to blow by that. That's what we're all going to be eating on as we run through here. So if you're here for CEUs from any of these organizations, you can get up to 13 if you stay for all 4. And we're going to be giving out a bunch of books. So we have the one and only Dan Ariely. Let's get a massive emoji explosion from him. He's written some of my favorite books. Predictably Irrational, I read kind of 2008 or something like that, and that totally kind of changed my life and gave me a new lens to look through things. We of course have the one and only Christian Hunt. Round of applause for Christian. He wrote one of my other favorite books, Humanizing Rules. We've given away hundreds of these books over the years, and so glad to have him here. And also one more for Nadej Rochelle. So we're going to be giving out 100 books today, 25 per session. We're featuring these books, the Ethicsverse Library Starter Kit giveaway. We're going to be giving away some of Dan's books. These are the ones that we're featuring, and Christian's books as well. So keep those comments coming in the chat. We're going to have a conversation about behavioral economics. And also, if you have not checked out the toolkits that our team has put together, there's 20 different toolkits. These things are actually very helpful that you can leverage, grab, and start to improve your program. So ideas are free. It's all about execution. So we got a couple of ideas for you to run forward with. Those should be available on your console right now. And for Ethicsverse Day, because we love you, we're giving 25% off on all of our solutions. This session, Predictably Irrational session, is brought to you by Policy Plus. So Policy Plus is our brand new platform. But I'll talk about that a little bit later because we're actually going to get started with our new AI assistant. Sorry about that. So we have a new AI assistant inside of our case management system. And this thing will allow you to aggregate a bunch of information very quickly, scan all the information attached to a case or to an investigation, and generate summaries in real time. So we had one client who was in a board meeting. A board member asked her about a particular case. She was able to get that summary in real time across this complex investigation and close that loop directly in the meeting. It also has this really cool ability to do analytics for you. So raise your hand if you love living in Excel. Well, you probably don't. I don't see any hands up. So this can take a lot of that work out. You can ask it natural language questions and so forth. We call her Ethel. And so if you're interested in checking that out, contact your client success rep. Here's some information for it. So we are going to dive directly into the session right now. We have the one and only, like I said, Dan Ariely. His new book, Misbelief, is absolutely phenomenal. You can scan this code and check him out. And he also has one of his, one of my favorite courses he's just made public recently. And I've just learned so much from Dan. Dan, so glad that you're here. Thanks for joining us today.
Lovely to be here.
And then also Christian Hunt. Christian runs Human Risk. If you don't know Christian, welcome to Earth. He's kind of the Dan Ariely of the compliance space. He's somebody I've learned so much about on how to actually bring some of these behavioral science concepts to bear within an organization. And super pumped to have you here, as always, Christian.
Always a thrill to be with you.
Handsome, you should say. You should say he
is handsome. He's one of the most handsome, charming people I've ever met. And then, of course, Nadej. What's happening, Nadej? So glad you could join us as well.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's kind of dive in here. Dan, I want to kind of start with you. We've learned over the years that, bigger penalties rarely move behavior. And, you've done so much work over the years on behavioral science or in the behavioral science space. You've you spent 20 years kind of showing that like misconduct is really less about bad apples and more about kind of ordinary people in sort of, particular situations. If that's true, I think most compliance people or most compliance programs are kind of built for the wrong person, this theoretical kind of rational actor. What is the right one? What could somebody who's in this space, who's trying to influence behavior in their organization, what could you clarify for them around who their program should really be designed for?
Yeah, so you're framing it actually in a very good way. Can you hear me well? I'm using these
perfect.
AirPods. It's working. So we are really designing those programs for sociopaths. We're designing those programs for people who have no morals, and they're just making a cost-based calculation of what's worth it for them. And the interesting thing is when we look at our own lives, very, very rarely do we say that we're engaging in such behaviors. I've gone to lots of restaurants and I ask the waiter, I say, if you were going to recommend to me a method to escape this restaurant without paying, give me some advice. And then I said, look, I'm a researcher. I'm not really going to do it, but give me some advice. And they always have good advice. Say you're going to the bathroom, do all kinds of things. And I say, and how often do people do it? He said, almost never. He said, sometimes people forget to pay and they leave and we don't catch them. Because with credit cards, people don't even remember that if they paid or not. They call back to say, sorry, I forgot to pay. So we are designing programs for people who are cold, hard, calculated criminals. And I'm not saying that these are zero people. There's the mafia and so on, and we can talk about it. There's some people who do those calculations. But mostly, it's something very different. And mostly, it's the story of taking a small step and rationalizing it. And then taking another small step and rationalizing. And the thing about rationalization is that people don't think that they're doing something bad at all. They think they're doing something good. And because of that, the tools that we need to use are very different. So let me give you an example. I used to own a vending machine, not as a business, but for experiments. And I set up the vending machine on campus, and I had a big sign that says, candy, 75 cents. But I programmed the machine to 0. So if you put your money and you press the button, you would get the candy and all the money because everything is above 0. And my question was, how many candies will people take? And I had a big sign above the machine that says, if something is wrong, call this number. It was my phone number. First of all, how many people do you think called?
Less than
0.
20%. Yeah.
0, nobody called. But how many candies did people take? And it turns out that the majority took 3 or 4. Nobody took 5. Now, they could have just emptied the machine.
Right.
But what happened is that people can cheat a little bit and still feel good about themselves. They say, I remember this other vending machine that took my candy and took my money and didn't give me a candy. And this other vending machine gave me an old candy. And I know that those other vending machines are close relative to this vending machine. So I'm just evening in my credit, my vending karma. People were making their own rules in a way that was good for them, but they were not thinking of themselves as criminals. So if you think about people as rationalizing animals, there are things that are good for us. We have conflicts of interest. And then we can rationalize misbehavior to some degree. I used to ask people who are on online dating, what is their age on online dating? Everybody is slightly younger. People don't think that they're criminals. They're saying, I'm 59, but do I really look 59? I look more like 57. It's actually more accurate to put 57. So we don't do it by saying, I'm breaking the law, we're justifying it. And our real enemy is not cost-benefit analysis. Our real enemy is our incredible ability to rationalize bad behavior. And if you start with that, you would come up with very different conclusions. Because you say, if you have a big penalty and people don't think that they're doing anything bad, they're not even calculating that. It's not part of the equation. So we need to really think about, look, every time we don't like something that human nature is doing, we have to understand why. Because if we don't understand the why, we will create rules that don't help. And in the case of compliance, I'm not saying that there are no bad apples, but most people are good apples that just rationalize from time to time and then go down a slippery slope. And to fight that, you need a very different set of tools.
So you kind of make this point that people are kind of like cheating directly up to this sort of line or this point where they like can't look at themselves in the mirror and see an honest person, right? Like you call them, you call human beings rationalization animals. I've called us like rationalization machines. Like it's really crazy what human beings can rationalize. What does this fudge factor mean, do you think, for compliance? And like if more penalties don't sort of deter the behavior in that sort of realm of rationalization, or like in that tier where, rationalization happens, like what or whose types of policies and penalties should we be leveraging to actually, like, how do we end up influencing this behavior for this, the 2%, to your point, the sociopaths, they're going to kind of do it regardless. Then we have this sort of 98% sort of in the middle. How do we better kind of affect those folks' behavior beyond just kind of understanding that everyone's kind of has some rationalization, factor or some kind of fudge factor kind of inherent to them?
Yeah, so let's take the dating example. So I said I'm 59, I'm going to a dating site. I would feel okay saying I'm 57, but 50, that's too much. Like, people don't like too much. But you could say from a compliance perspective, you don't want 57 and you don't want 55, you want 59. And the two answers are basically about getting people to have higher ethics at the moment. So, when I feel the age, there's all kinds of things that I can do right now to increase the salience of this number being important. If you say, what's your age? That's one thing. But if you say something different, you say, in this system, it is very important that everybody report an accurate age. It's important for you, it's important for others. So we pay high attention to that, or we care. At that moment, you understand this is not just another number. This is an important number. And all of a sudden, you pay attention to it. Now, if I say, and after you put this number, I want you to sign that this is indeed your age. So there is something to do about the systems. There's something to do about the systems. Think about every company is creating lots of systems. There's systems for expense reports, and there are systems for travel allowance, and there are systems for reporting, all kinds of things. In those systems, if you identify the things that you really care about, you can make things much more salient. You can get people to focus on that moment and say, okay, this is a professional moment. It's not just a regular one. And then the second thing is about culture. So I'll give you a story. I got a request once from a consulting company. And they said, all of our consultants, we found out were cheating on the ethics module. And I said, okay, tell me about the culture. Tell me about the culture. What was going on? And they said, we gave people this module, but we really didn't give them time to do it. These are very busy consultants. They work very long hours, and we gave it to them in addition. I said, culturally, did you make them feel that this is important, or that this is a check-the-box approach that they need to get over in order to do something? And they said, we didn't intend to, but if you think about it, that's what we did. So, we said, you're working 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. We're giving you this as well. We're not giving you time to do it. We're not emphasizing that. It's clearly a second priority. Or I'll give you another example. There was a gas company that told their employees that if they go to investigate a gas leak, they can park illegally. And the most important thing is to rush to the gas leak. It turns out that the same people were not wearing their protective gear. And some got injured. And again, they said, why don't they wear the protective gear? I said, you're telling them that the rules don't matter. You're telling them that the only thing is important is for you to get there very quickly. But no, the rules are important. And if you say to people, oh, we don't care about penalty parking, but we do care about closing, that's a very complex message. You need to tell people you are professionals and everything about your professionalism matters. So my answer is two-pronged. There are things we could do in the environment, the forms, the saliency, get people to sign, get people to focus, get people to realize that this number represents something meaningful. And the second thing is culture. And we have to admit that in culture, we often give people very conflicting signals. And we have to change that. We have to change that. I can tell you more stories, but I think this is the essence, the environment and the culture. Oh, I don't hear you. I didn't hear you, the question.
I think he's on mute, Dan. So maybe we can just continue a conversation while we wait for Nick to get back.
Okay.
A couple of things I wanted to add to what you were saying. I think what's really interesting is when you look at compliance programs is that they often focus on the worst possible outcome. So we think about a rogue trader who might take down a bank or somebody who might do something that's detrimental, and we focus on that and we say that's the problem we're trying to solve. But what's interesting about it is if somebody's really determined to do something, then lots of the compliance interventions that we use, training would be a good example. Training only works if people want to be trained. And so on the one hand, we have compliance programs that sort of presume that people are willing to go along with it. Because we've all been to training courses where we've learned nothing, where we've physically sat there but not listened. So training relies on people who want to learn and are willing to learn. And so if we're looking at these bad people, then actually a lot of the techniques that we use won't catch them. And so focusing on them is the wrong answer. What we need to do, I think, is focus on, and Nick talked about the 2% of bad apples. I would argue there's a very small number of people that will never break rules. We want to watch those as well, because that's weird. The biggest bang for buck is targeting those people in the middle. And so my view is we need to recognize that we're going to need them to be on board on some level. And so I think we put controls in place for the extremity. And then we focus, to your point, around what are the actual people, the average person in the organization who comes to work trying to do the right thing.
That's right. And let me expand on that, because I think that it actually gets worse. So let's take an organization, and I can think of mine, but we can think. A bad event happened. What is the gut reaction of the organization? Let's add many more layers of rules that would make it impossible for somebody to do exactly that particular crime. Now, are we eliminating crime? No. Are we eliminating the people who are determined to do something? No. But we are making a lot of people now don't like the organization and don't care. I'll give you myself as an example. It used to be very easy to do research. I could dream up an idea at night. I could mostly run the experiment the next day or 2 days later with all the permissions and so on. Now it's very hard for me to run anything in less than 3 to 6 months. Now, you could say that the organization is adding lots and lots of bureaucracy because bad things happen. Where is my motivation? Where is my interest? People are like I think one of the things is that I understand the gut feeling. Something bad happened, and it's an emotional thing. I never want to see this again. It was my job. I want to block that particular hole, but it's part of the cost of business to deal with people. And what we do often is we punish the good people and we eliminate motivation. And what I think compliance needs, and this is what you're alluding to, I think compliance needs a healthier cost-benefit analysis to say, okay, so here are these 17 rules that can eliminate this thing from happening again. What's the benefit and what's the cost? And,
can you guys hear me now?
Other thing.
Yeah.
Let me say one other thing. And
please, yeah.
One other thing that is very important is to realize the slippery slope. And it's not as if I've talked to a lot of crooks. And it's not as if when you talk to these crooks, they started with the big thing that they ended up doing. No, in fact, they started with a small step, rationalized, took the next step and rationalized and so on. And as an organization, we often don't look at the small steps. We look at, okay, when something big happened, let's think about that. But it didn't just happen. There was a big step leading toward it. And yes, sure, we can try and create a set of rules that would eliminate these things to happen. But let's look at the pathway. Let's look at how did these things started, and let's try and solve it in the beginning. Like, I looked at so many terrible misbehaviors within organization that started with good people that felt the organization gave them a task that they couldn't achieve, like the gas people who were running to their job to do it faster without wearing protective gears, and then deteriorated from there. So we're not looking at the path of progress of the bad behaviors. We just look at the last thing. We say, I don't want that. I'll give you a terrible example. Universities, sadly, have a terrible history of young men doing terrible things to women. Really terrible. Like it breaks my heart to see what is happening. And we looked at that, and it's very rare that students come to my university, to Duke, with that they are sexual predators. But there's a process. There's a process. And if you just look at them at the end, you're not going to solve the problem. You're going to punish one person here and there. What you need to understand is what is the path that allows you to accept to work or to college a decent human being, and then unintentionally help them develop into something very different.
Yeah, I mean, somebody that's on death row, at one point they were an innocent little baby, and there's a series of steps that have happened over time, right? Nadej.
Yeah.
Oh, Nadej, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say it's the environment, right? What kind of environment, what kind of culture really brought this kind of behavior that kind of led to the incidents. And I think, what Dan, you were saying, it's really echo, because I think sometimes we are really the architect of those friction in our compliance program, those 80 pages long SOP that no one reads, Is there a way for us to make it actually easier for people who wants to do the right thing to comply? We build those processes that create so much friction. So it's just create turnarounds. And so people to be able to perform their action, what they do is they find their shortcut in the process because they are not able to perform their work. They have pressure to execute, to get the project done in a short time. but compliance is asking them to have those administrative additional steps where they don't even understand why they have to do it. So it really echoes for me what you're saying, the storytelling and why behind, and how, compliance could be a bit more also vocal in telling the story about what it is important and why does it matter. And I could share an example on that. When we had a privacy regulation in Europe that was quite impacting, and we had to perform a lot of administrative signature consent for our stakeholders, healthcare professionals. And no one wanted to sign the form because it's like kind of overwhelming. You have this form, you have to provide your consent. It was at the beginning. What we did is we did a series of small videos to really cut down about what it is, what's it for them, why do we ask them to have this document signed. With the small videos, the message was not given by compliance people, but by their stakeholders. So people in the field, people in the marketing faces they knew. And the result is we got 70% increase of the consent rate because they understood why they had to comply, right? So I think small things like this can really help to support people to be compliant and follow your process, using a different hat, like a marketing act, to be able to bring that to the organization.
Yeah,
and
there's a lot of times when people don't understand why it is that they're doing something. So if you say most bureaucracy is perceived by people as the organization doesn't trust me, the organization doesn't respect my time, and the organization doesn't want me to do anything different. And it's a terrible thing to communicate. Now, sometimes those things are true, but there are many cases where there's a real good reason for something. Like I talk to people in IT, and I said, from time to time, you ask people to change their passwords. You force people to change their password. It's a mess. I just got used to my old password. It's so much work to remember the new one. Sometimes people write a note, they make it even less safe. I said, why don't you spend an extra 5 minutes explaining why? We have this mechanical view of people that are doing that. So I think that this. I don't think we can explain all bureaucracy, but I think that when we can, we certainly should.
I think it's worth reflecting on. Sorry, Nadesh, go on.
No, I was going to add also, you use the terminology bureaucracy, and I think it's also because we tend to add on, and you provide the example. Now, we had the findings, and then we add 17 findings. In organization, you have maybe a regular audit. In organization I work for, we had maybe annual audits, and every time you have a new findings, and every year you're built based on what they said. And I think sometimes we forget to take a zoom out approach and really look at, is there a way for us to reduce the bureaucracy and really embed everything in a process that the business is taking, right? So it's making compliance invisible rather than something on the top of where, it creates friction for people. So I think it's another angle where we could really invest as a team rather than adding something on the top of.
But that's kind of the natural response, right? Of this, I'll go to you 1 second, Christian, but that is the natural sort of knee-jerk response of our function in many cases, is to just add some more. Let's add another rule. Let's put some suspenders on with this belt, kind of a thing. And that inadvertently kind of creates some friction as opposed to zooming out where usually kind of more is less. What were you going to say, Christian?
Well, I think we should look at why this happens. So I agree there's a natural tendency in compliance to do that. But there is actually a good reason often why that happens. And one of your sessions today is the perfect illustration of it, which is regulators, or in the case of the US, the DOJ, often don't question that kind of thing, right? They look at it and they actively encourage. So some of the guidance that you get actively encourages people to additive solutions. And nobody wants to take things away for fear of what will happen if they've taken that particular thing away, and somehow that'll be linked to the issue. So I think when we're looking at this challenge, we need to recognize that there's behavioral science all over this stuff. Right? There's behavioral science in terms of we're trying to influence people to behave in a particular way to follow our rules. But there's also behavioral science around how we respond to regulators. And I think regulators often create problems. They're part of the problem here. The way they set rules, they encourage organizations to behave in that particular way. I can't stand it when I see best practice being sold. Who says it's best practice? We should be challenging these things. But we need to look at that dynamic and say often compliance people are responding to either what regulators tell them to do or what they think regulators tell them to do. And one of the things I would want people on this show to take away is that often we presume that we know what regulators want. And we want solutions that keep them happy, right? We want to keep them away from our door. We want to make sure if we get into trouble that we have a really good narrative to tell. I think we should start challenging ourselves more to say, is that actually true? Is that really what they want? Or to Dan's point, can we actually achieve their objective by other means? And we should be looking much more at the substance of the rules and therefore actually run some risk here. Because I think compliance, we often look at the target as 100% compliance. We are never going to get that. No organization is ever 100% compliant. We need to approach this like a risk challenge and say we should have a risk appetite for compliance. Right? Stuff that can get people killed, cause serious reputational risk, we should be all over. Maybe there are some other rules where we'd rather people didn't do it, but we'll tolerate it. And I think we need to be much more adult about this. And the sorts of conversations we should be having with regulators is along similar lines.
Yeah.
But it's so hard to do that, right?
I want to echo this cost-benefit analysis. So think about driving. People die. People get injured. Our response is not no cars. We understand. Like the cost is awful. The cost is awful. I was badly injured. I was in hospital for 3 years. I tell you, like the cost of injury is very, very tough. I wasn't in a car accident, but we understand cost and benefit in some very important ways. And I think what's really missing in compliance is even the discipline of cost and benefit. I'm saying, okay, decide what you want to do later, but at least start having the conversation and saying, okay, if nobody ever has a glass of wine at dinner paid by the company, okay, what's the benefit? What's the cost? Let's understand it. If people hire their friends, what's the cost? What's the benefit? Let's start understanding it. Without it, we are creating a system that is separating from the organization because it doesn't have the same objectives.
And it doesn't even have the same lens that it uses to make decisions. One is very black and white. One is by its nature sort of expected value based, where there is that 2%, as you were talking about earlier, or kind of what Christian alluded to, that you're never going to get kind of 100% compliance. So like there's just a natural sort of separation, and then your department is watching a very different movie than the rest of the organization, and this sort of bureaucratic sort of barnacle on the ship is what we can sort of calcify into if we're not careful.
Yeah, very, 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 very much so. And again, and the other thing that I would like to say, so I think there's a cost-benefit analysis, but the other thing I think is we need to think better about the psychology of bad behavior. If we think about just the outcome, and we say people are rational actor, it will be very different. I'll give an example. We worked with a very large company, and what we asked people who were in senior positions was to talk about the history of some of their unethical decisions. Now, we were very careful not just to talk about the final bad step, but to talk about the anatomy of how something has happened, right? So you say, I went to this place and they offered me this and we tried this and then this happened and then I owed. Like they talked, we intentionally created a story about the process. And it wasn't about accusing people. It wasn't, here's a high-ranking person in this company who misbehaved. It's about, let's understand the condition that got him to do that. Let's understand why somebody was silent when they should have said something. Let's talk when something happened. And it became a big part of their training program because you want to understand the psychological pressures. Like, take any company and ask the question of what are the psychological pressures that can create bad behavior. There are many of them. Now, do people think of themselves as bad actors? No. But are they susceptible to those bad pressures? Absolutely. How do you get somebody to understand in more nuanced way? It's a bit like in medicine, you want preventative care. How do you get people to say, oh, you know what? I'm now in a room where people are not saying what's really on their mind. There's a pressure against that. Oh, I'm now in a room where there is something said that was unethical, and nobody's, because it came from a high, people are not doing it. I think that understanding the process is crucial for prevention.
What would you add to that, Nadej?
Yeah, it's really cool for me because I think when you look at our Speak Up programs, the integrity lines and how do we help our employee to have this psychological safety to be able to raise their concern, ask question without being the fear of being retaliated. And I think it's the base of any compliance program. And I think it's obviously you have the culture of the organization, some precedent that maybe people start to speak up and then they could see that they had some retaliation. But I think also what I have seen and what we try to do is how do we change the perception of this, right? It's doing the right thing. You're speaking up, you're raising your concern. It's the right thing to do. Instead of, saying, if you don't do it, this is the fine, this is the consequences. I think we're trying to make it as a cultural positive element of the organization. And I think on those ones, what works well, at least from my perspective, what I have tried to implement is really making sure that you can explain what's behind as well. So we had a case where I came to an organization new and no one were speaking up. We had no cases. There was nothing there. It was a bit, opaque, not really transparent process. People didn't really want to speak against their manager, or they would not even, raise any concern to the manager. And so we tried to explain the process behind, and we said your manager is not going to get a ticket in some big organization. Whenever you try to do something, your manager gets a ticket for approval. So we try to clarify that as well. There is no burden administration around that. Doing this is the right thing, really helps us. And we had some cases where really people started to raise their concern. And one case we investigated, and actually it did help us to really improve the process because the process was maybe not clear. We had no clear rules and responsibilities. So we really strengthened the process in a way that it was easier for people to comply with. And we actually publicized that, advertised that, thanks to someone that spoke up. We were able to help to sort out the whole process. And this is a new process because of that. And I think this really helped them to have further additional cases where people felt that actually it was okay to do so. It brings some positive aspect, and people do something about it, which I think is really good. Obviously, we have to. Speaking up is, there is a lot of cultural aspect as well. So it depends the country where you're sitting. It's not the same messages as well. So I think you have to be considered, I know we have a lot of people online from across the globe. So I want to be also careful that some culture are easier than others when we speak, in terms of speak up.
Can I say something on that?
Sorry. Yeah, please.
So I used to spend some time with Google. And I'm not going to get into the complexity of the ethics of Google, but at the time, they had this term called googly. And they basically created a cultural acceptance where anywhere in the conversation, it would be perfectly fine to say, is this googly? Which meant, does this stand to our values? Now, imagine it was you and me in a meeting, and I say, are you ethical? That's tough. I don't think I could do that, to ask something. But when you don't point it to the person and you point it to the idea, and you have a cute word, googly, it's like a soft, kind word. It's not ethics and compliance. Does this comply with our ethical standards? That's tough. And I was in a lot of meetings when this term came up. Now, and I think that it also became perfectly acceptable to slow a meeting and say, how does this fit with our values? And I saw quite a few discussions and some changes in decision-making about it. And I thought it was a beautiful cultural idea of saying, don't argue the person, discuss the idea, have it at a low level of entry. You don't want a high threshold. Only,
Right.
is this violating our standard
Is this
code of conduct?
damnable? Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
But there's something interesting. I mean, that's interesting, Dan, because what that does is it reflects the realities of human interactions, right? If you just say, well, people should speak up, then that ignores the whole fact that it's psychologically challenging. Junior people, and I think a lot of the programs that we design are designed for this fantasy world that doesn't exist, where we sort of say to people,
100%.
we pretend that people aren't going to have ethical issues, right? It's very here's how you simply just follow the process. The world is messy as hell. People make mistakes. Things get confusing. Corporate values clash with each other. If one of your values is profitability and another one is safety, at some point, those two things come into conflict with each other. And so if you start to look at what we've actually done is created a world that's impossible for humans to navigate. And I think what we need to start doing, and I think that's a great example, Dan, is to say, okay, let's recognize that real humans in the real world are going to come across situations that we can't easily codify, that are problematic, that come with that logically they ought to do, but psychologically for some reason they might not want to. That might be reasonable, that might feel unreasonable, but this is actually what's happening. And so if we start to look at the realities of human existence and the sorts of challenges we know people are going to face, I think then we can start to design programs, and whether that's speak up programs or whether that's that reflects the realities of life. And I think the challenge that we have is often the language that's used is things like zero tolerance. And I saw in the chat somebody was asking, why do we talk about zero? Zero tolerance sounds great, except if you say it, you better mean it. And 9 times out of 10, you probably don't mean it because, well, heck, hey, it's a senior person, so we're just going to turn a blind eye to that one. If you say zero tolerance and then don't demonstrate it, then that's worse than not saying it at all. And we have this I think this very dishonest narrative. We are an ethical organization. Say you get this in induction training. We are a very ethical. Well, number one, why are you saying that? Shouldn't it be? Should it be obvious, or are you protesting too much? Second thing is, if you tell me that in induction training, and I go out in the real world and I spot this not an ethical organization, 2 things are going to happen. One is I'm more likely to follow the unethical path because everybody else is doing it. But the second thing is I'm going to think this organization is dumb. They're dishonest because they're telling me something that's patently not true. And so I think we have to move away from this world of pretending everything's perfect, that everybody's always compliant, that everything's going to be incredibly easy if you just follow the rules, that you haven't got... We need to be more realistic. And I think that means I'm not saying we say last month we had 50 examples of non-compliance, but we need to think realistic. And when we're talking to senior leaders, let's not have a narrative with them that says we'll guarantee the organization's compliant. You can't do that. And we need to treat employees with a bit more respect, I think, and reflect the realities of their lives. And sometimes that means they're going to be in difficult situations.
Yeah, and we are not robots yet, so it's impossible, right, to have 100% compliance. We are all humans, so we make mistakes. And I just wanted to add something of what you said, and I think it really resonates with me, because I think that's the whole problem of compliance. When we are challenging people on a decision, or, you ask question, it's seen as we are challenging them as not being an ethical person, rather than if you're a marketing person that would challenge an idea on the concept. I think it's not touching the person. But I think compliance, because of our role and the ethics and compliance people, when we challenge a project and we ask questions, it's seen by people we are saying to them, you're not ethical. So it takes personally, and I think it really doesn't help with the perception, right, of our function and our team. So that's really powerful. Thanks for sharing that, because it really resonates with me.
Yeah, just say googly next time,
I want to add a little story. I want to add a little story from the Bible. So there's a story that God comes to Sarah. It says, Sarah, you're going to have a child. And Sarah laughs. She said, how can I have a son when my husband is so old? And God says, don't worry, you'll have a son. And then God goes to Abraham and says, Abraham, you're going to have a son. And Abraham says, did you tell Sarah? And God says, yes. And Abraham continues, and he said, and what did Sarah say? And God lies. In the story, God says, Sarah said, how could she have a son when she is so old? And the religious scholars they wondered, how could God lie? How could that be? And their conclusion was that it's okay to lie for peace at home. Now, the thing I'm bringing this up really is about the comments, about the fact that ethics is really a very complex trade-off of values. And this trade-off is not going to have always a clean-cut way. It's very complex. It's the story of decision-making. It's a story of trading off different things. And with ethics, that's the story. Telling Abraham that Sarah thinks he's too old, or telling the truth. Being late to a meeting and telling people that we didn't think it was that important, so we stay in the office a bit longer, or saying there was traffic. You mentioned the example of profits versus safety. What about somebody who's a low performer? What do you tell them? These are very, very complex topics, and I think that solving them needs to be about giving people tools to recognize the situation, to discuss the complexity, and hopefully most of the time making the right decision. But if you have a rule, it just doesn't acknowledge the inherent complexity of this. Like, how many people want to be married to somebody who always told you the truth?
I don't. Not me.
And I think, if you tell the rule as well, if you look at the world we are living in, everything is changing every day with technologies, geopolitics and stuff. So if we stick to the rule, it's going to be outdated, really immediately. And it's hard for people to follow. I think we should follow the approach of, helping them with principles, values. And so whenever they have a risk, they can recognize it. And really, I love the way you're saying, giving them the tools. And I would add, help them practice when it's safe. What I said to my team, you can, if you don't go to the gym every day and you're running, then if there is a fire in the house, it's going to be hard for you to escape from it. But if you've been practicing running and know how to escape, then it's easier to when something happened to escape that. So I think it's also making sure we are practicing the behavior we want to see. So when we have a pressure moment, or where we have a moment where we have to put them into practice, we know how to behave.
Yeah, and also reinforcing that behavior that you want to see. Like back to that story you told about, you did some research and you made some changes to the process, and that kind of opened up a floodgates of a lot more risk intelligence coming from the workforce. That was way more effective than putting up yet another sort of, mute poster on the wall, or changing the SIG, your signature below your email, which are all fine things to do. But
can you hear me?
We respond. How do we actually affect this culture in this larger organization? There's certain agencies that a compliance team. I'm the only one who's here.
We can hear you, Dan.
We can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
okay.
Since I don't know what is going on, I'll continue.
Yeah, let's hear it.
And I want to tell you a story about the study we did where we allowed people to be dishonest and grade themselves and make more money. And the first thing we saw is the basic thing we always see. We saw that lots of people were cheating just a little bit. So imagine you have like a math test and you solve the question and you can grade yourself, and then you say, tell us how many questions you got and we'll pay you accordingly, but you grade yourself. So you know how many questions you graded. And then what happened is that we did another condition in which we told people that the money that they're going to make is not going to be for themselves, it's going to be for a charity. What do you think? When people cheated for themselves, by the way, lots of people cheated a little bit. Almost nobody cheated a lot. Very few people didn't cheat. Lots of people cheated a little bit. What happened when people cheated for a charity? When they said, the money you're going to make today is going to go for this, your favorite charity. It turns out people cheated more. A little bit more. Because why? Because if you're cheating for yourself, you kind of feel bad at some point. But if you're cheating for a charity, you're acting well. And then we did a study again, but this time we connected people to a lie detector. And we asked the question of whether the lie detector can detect whether people are lying or not. And when people were cheating for themselves, the lie detector could detect when people were lying. We did it with a policeman who was an expert in lie detector, and the policeman could actually measure people lying and predict and find out who was cheating more and who was cheating less. What happened to the lie detector when people were lying for charity? It turns out the lie detector was not working in those conditions. How come? It's because people did not think they were doing something wrong. People were thinking that they were lying for a good purpose. Think about Robin Hood. Robin Hood was robbing from the rich. Did he think he was acting badly? No. If I could guess, I would say that Robin Hood was feeling ethical when he was robbing the rich, and he was probably feeling he was wasting his time when he was not. So really what's stopping us, it's our ethics. I don't feel good about this. But our ethics are very complex. It's about what we think is right and what we think is wrong. And we often find that when people feel that they're being unethical for a good reason, it actually liberates them. People are not as selfish, and when they're doing it for the company and so on. Like, think about somebody who is helping a company succeed by cutting corners. Are they feeling that they're unethical, or are they feeling that they're doing the right thing? Okay, I don't know if this has been recorded or not. I'm going to reload and see what happens.
Yes, it has been recorded, so we'll see you when you get back. But what I was, what I kind of wanted to get down to kind of in these last few minutes here is, something that we've kind of been talking about and sort of mentioned tangentially. And it's that like there's a certain contagion available to us, and that can either be working sort of for us or against us. And that contagion really kind of only seems to happen when someone identifies with, the other party, right? Like if you identify with the cheater, then you're going to be more contagious to like emulate that behavior, which kind of gets back down to like, if leaders aren't exhibiting, middle managers, leaders, whatever, aren't exhibiting that ethical behavior, well, then the odds of their, the people that report to them, going above and beyond is significantly lower. So I'd love to kind of start with you, Christian. How can we take advantage of that to a greater degree? We all talk about tone at the top, and we all talk about zero tolerance, and a lot of these sort of terms within our industry kind of turn into these platitudes that we just sort of throw around that can sometimes create some headwinds for us. And as you said before, like we needed to design programs for not like what we want to happen, but what is likely to happen. So given what we've talked about today, what do you think are a couple of things that people can start to bring to their job tomorrow or over the next quarter to actually kind of put some of these practices in place to affect, to use that contagion for good,
Yeah, look, I'll take the question more broadly and say, how can we think about things? Well, the first thing is recognize the reality of human existence, right? So the phrase that you paraphrased there, the one I used is to say, we need to think not what we would like people to do, but what they're likely to do. In other words, let's not have a fantasy world where everybody is 100% focused on compliance. And I always say, if the average employee is not interested in compliance, I don't mean they go to work wanting to break the rules, but I mean they're not passionate about the subject, because if they were, they'd be working in compliance. So we need to just recognize the realities of people's existence and think about what forces can we use. And compliance typically uses logic. I think what we need to start using is use, and I'll steal shamelessly here from behavioral scientist Rory Sutherland, psychologic, not as opposed to logic, right? Think about the drivers that drive people. What are other people doing? What are they perceiving? What pressures are they under? What things are we incentivizing through our remuneration program that we're telling them we don't actually want them to do? And when we look at those reality, recognize those things, you will suddenly discover there's a load of factors that you haven't thought about in your program. And if we can start to think about some of those things, recognize dynamics, we can expand the toolkit. So the social pressures you talked about is one thing, but there are lots of other techniques that we can use if we recognize the realities of some of the dynamics that are there. And some of those things are very counterintuitive, but I think that's the challenge ahead of us.
That's great. That's really phenomenal. What would you add to that, Nadej?
So for me, I think one thing that we can do for us to be better is to co-create. I really value that. I think in compliance, one of the tools we overuse is training and completion rate for training, which is, I think, completely useless. I really hate when we look at that, how many people complain to complete the training and 98%, 99%, and we are looking at why 1% of the person didn't do it, instead of really focusing about what was the outcome. Did we change people's behavior? So I think, what I usually do is I try to co-create with people, trying to understand if there is an issue, speak with those people, ask what they know about the topic, what confused them about the process, the topic, and what would make their job easier in a way that, first you will learn so much about this, because at the end of the day, we are often building processes that are followed by other people. So why don't we ask them in the first place? And why do we think that we can come up with their own solution alone? And then secondly, yeah?
No. I was just going to cheer you on. Please keep going.
And I think, and then secondly, what happened is they will defend what they've created. So they are going to be the one, selling it to the organization on your behalf. And actually, to take back what Christian has written in his wonderful book, is often when it comes to compliance communication, the message is not the issue, but it's the messenger. So compliance, has some weight when we are communicating. So if we can leverage other people in the organization, it's actually working way better. And I have so many examples of this working in practice. So that's something I would say that we should start to do. And actually, when you think about it, there is no cost when you do that. You don't need to have additional technology. You don't need to have specific sign-off. It doesn't need to be approved by the legal team. So I think, this is something we can easily implement today. And I'm assuring you it's going to have a way more impact than your last 3 e-learning module you just created with AI.
And I mean, just think about when you're rolling out a policy or when you're rolling out a training, to your point, we can kind of take a page out of Dan's playbook when he goes to restaurants on how to kind of dine and dash, asking somebody like, what if this training resonates? How would somebody get around this rule? Or like, here's the spirit of what we're trying to solve for. I don't know the nuance of what a day-to-day is like on the sales department or on the marketing department or the operations, whatever. Getting some of that input, you're probably going to see uncover some blind spots you might have, first of all, and you're also going to get some feedback that's going to allow that to probably take root to a greater degree, because it's going to be more well-informed. The added dimensionality, you're going to be able to trim away the unessential stuff, and you've opened up the opportunity for them to kind of participate in whatever that is. So there's a lot of insights that can be kind of gathered from those folks right on the front lines. I have a whole nother thing I want to kind of talk about briefly here.
Am I on?
You are on, yeah. Yeah,
okay,
you're on.
So I disappeared for a while, or you disappeared. I didn't know what to do.
No, but we heard it.
I gave a lecture.
Yeah, we liked that lecture.
Did you?
Yeah, we liked it.
Did you hear what? Did you hear my lecture?
Yeah.
So,
yes.
So you were frozen for me. I didn't know.
All good. Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
I think that this idea of testing compliance approach by focusing on the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law is a brilliant idea. Is to say, okay, we have this rule. What do you think it means? What would we actually want you to do? Because language is always limited in capturing an idea. It's not the one-to-one. Lawyers sometimes get it wrong, and sometimes there's a risk. You could do something by the letter of the law, and miss the spirit of the law. But I think that saying, okay, so what is the spirit of this thing? Here's a new rule. What do you think it's all about? What are the issues? Because I can tell you that there are so many things that you can adhere to the letter of the law and completely bypass the intention. And then, should you be happy when that happens or no? I think not. I just want to summarize. Look, I always thought that ethics was very tough. I think this discussion makes it even more clear how tough ethics is, and you're experts in ethics in organizations. I'm an expert in ethics on individual. I think it's unbelievably complex. And I think we need to acknowledge that complexity, and we need to acknowledge that it's a struggle. There's no solution. It's like cancer. We can fight it. We need to fight it. We need to do things, but there's no winning. There's no winning. We have to live side by side with the complexity of human nature and the multiplicity of motivation, and do our best as we do that.
Yeah, it's unrealistic to expect that we're going to kind of hermetically seal our organization against any wrongdoing or any of the gray areas that exist in the world or in our businesses. So to your point, we have to be able to kind of tolerate that gray and be able to kind of navigate through that with some common sense and some empathy to put solutions that are really more toward that invisible compliance that helps to reinforce this culture of integrity that we're trying to build. So we are right at time. I wish this was a double session, because this was, I feel like we were just getting started. There was so much to talk about. I hope everybody enjoyed this session. Let's get a massive emoji explosion for our speakers today. Dan Ariely, thank you so much for coming. Christian, as always, anytime you're on, I always learn something, and I also get a little something I can steal. So appreciate that. I got a couple of things I could steal from you today, and Nadej, absolutely phenomenal. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Stay tuned. We're going to take a little bio break, get a little lunch if you want. If you haven't been stuffing your face for the last hour, now's your chance. And we're going to be starting again at 1:15. So thank you guys all. See you soon. Bye-bye.